The Ride1UP Rift might seem like a typical fat tire e-bike, but it's not. Let's go for a ride and find out why. Before we get started, please take a second to like and subscribe. This keeps you informed when we upload new videos so that we can help you find an awesome e-bike for you. So obviously the Rift is a fat tire bike, and with that comes a fairly standard set of features and characteristics. I like them because they're generally pretty good bang for your buck. They can do a little bit of everything. They're usually pretty big, but they've got the power to make up for it. They're usually pretty comfortable to ride and also really stable, and they're not limited to just pavement. For example, I like playing around on some dirt paths right around the corner from the office whenever I get a chance to test one. It's important to note that bikes like the Rift aren't mountain bikes. They're not designed the same way at all, but they do allow you to do some things that other standard e-bikes don't handle so well. So with that in mind, the Rift, of course, has those big tires with some really knobby tread. It has a powerful 750 watt rear hub motor, which is as powerful as you can get on an e-bike without having to register it. And it also has a front suspension fork to make the ride a little bit more comfortable. Those things are all pretty standard, but the Rift has a few extras that make it just a good and very different kind of fat tire bike. First, I wasn't surprised to see a cargo rack, but I was surprised by how huge and beefy this one is. This one is welded to the rest of the frame. It has an awesome weight capacity of up to 150 pounds, and I was amazed to learn that it can actually carry an additional passenger. Ride1UP sells an accessory package that you can pick up separately called the passenger kit, which includes a seat pad, wheel guards, and foot pegs, and that allows you to carry up to a 130-pound rider on the back of this bike. The weight capacity is great. A lot of the racks on fat tire bikes we've tested can only hold 50 to 60 pounds, but it's pretty insane to get passenger capacity, and that pushes the Rift into sort of a hybrid territory with utility or cargo bikes. Cadence sensors are pretty standard too, but the one on this bike is actually one of the most sensitive I've seen. It actually engages the motor with just a slight movement of the cranks, which is about 1/8 of a turn. So basically that gave me power from the motor almost immediately, which felt awesome, but also made this bike a little more capable in off-road environments. On top of that, I love that the Rift could be unlocked to a class 3 with pedal assist up to 28 miles per hour. We had to contact Ride1UP to be able to do that, but the bike handled the speed really well, and I just had a blast cruising around on it. On top of that, I was really impressed with the settings menu within the display. That's where you can adjust the bike's top speed, but there are quite a few other options that you can change, like the number of pedal assist settings. I didn't mess around with it too much, but I thought it was really cool that you can actually tune the output of the motor within each of those. That's something I haven't seen very often, and I really like that it means you can make the Rift your own. I think that covers the big basics about the Rift and some of the differences between it and many of the other fat tire bikes out there, but let's take a closer look at the full list of specs and components that this one comes with. I talked a bit earlier about the Rift's motor, its suspension fork, and its tires, but I left a few things out and I want to make sure to revisit those. The motor is made by Aikima, or AKM, which isn't a brand we see a lot of, but they are reputable. I was happy to see that the suspension fork is actually an air and oil fork instead of a spring, and it actually has a full 120 millimeters of travel, and that's a bit more than we typically see on other fat tire bikes. The tires are made by Kenda. They're 26" by 4", pretty standard, but these are at least advertised as anti-puncture. I didn't necessarily test that, but I did a fair amount of off-roading without any problems, so it seems to check out. The saddle on the Rift is really great, and that might sound like a small thing, but this is probably the best saddle that I've tested so far. It's a gel saddle that helps to absorb a lot of vibrations, and I also just really like the shape. We didn't talk about the battery yet. The one here is a gigantic 48 volt 960 watt hour battery that's removable, but fully integrated into the down tube. That amount of capacity is pretty massive, but I think it makes sense on a bike that can handle cargo or an extra person. That much added weight can definitely eat through battery power. I was really happy with the 8-speed drivetrain here. That includes a Shimano Altus shifter and derailleur, a 44-tooth chainring, and an 11 to 32-tooth cassette. I expected there to be some fairly obvious ghost pedaling when the bike was unlocked to Class 3 speeds, but I was actually pleasantly surprised by how effective this setup was. The brake system is a hydraulic system by a brand called LBN, and that uses 180mm rotors on both wheels. I was surprised to learn that this was a 4-piston system. Most of the bikes we see, whether fat tire or not, have 2-piston brakes. There are metal fenders, there's a headlight included, and also a tail light with brake lights under the cargo rack here. It was great to see a color display. We don't usually see those on Ride1UP bikes. This one combines the LCD and a control panel into a single unit on the left handlebar. There's an under the bar style trigger shifter on the right bar, and I usually like that style, but I actually had a bit of trouble with this one. It felt like the shifter and the brake lever were crammed in too close to the grip, so the downshift lever there kept rubbing against my thumb, which was a little bit uncomfortable. I ended up scooting everything over, which helped that, but then shifting kind of needed a bit of a weird motion, so it ended up feeling a little awkward for some reason. That said, I liked that the Rift came with ergonomic rubber grips, but the bike's stem then actually felt a little too low, and I felt like I was leaning more forward on the grips than I would have preferred. This bike only comes in a single frame size, so I think it would be nice to see an adjustable stem included in the future. That would allow the bike to be a bit more comfortable and adjustable for taller people like me. But anyway, let's get into our test results and talk about how the Rift actually did. Overall, the Rift did pretty well in our brake test. We measured an average stopping distance of 22 feet and 1 inch, which is slightly better than our current average for all of the fat tire e-bikes we've tested. I liked the feel of the 4-piston hydraulic system here. Even when I slammed on the brakes, the wheels didn't lock up or skid, which just felt really stable and safe. That's never been a huge issue, even on bikes that do tend to skid a bit, but it's really nice to not have to worry about that at all here. We did expect a little bit of a shorter stopping distance with these brakes than we actually measured, but we're still pretty happy with where things ended up. The brakes on the Rift also have a motor cutoff feature, which is pretty common, but I think it makes a little bit more of a difference here than usual. I talked about how the cadence sensor on this bike was really good at giving power from the motor right away, but if I stopped pedaling, I could feel that power kind of hang on for longer than I wanted it to, especially off-road. I figured out that if I needed the bike to feel a bit more responsive, I could tap the brakes to stop the motor a little faster, and then of course that power was right there if I moved the pedals again. The timing of things took a little bit of adjustment, but overall I found this to be sort of a hack to improve the handling a little bit. The Rift did pretty well in our speed test too. It's a lot of fun just because of how fast it can get, although that speed was balanced a bit better in Class 3 mode than in Class 2 mode. The data we gathered in Class 2 mode showed a pretty big jump in power and speed, going from no motor assistance to PAS1, and then the power levels increased pretty steadily between PAS1 and PAS3, but then after that they kind of flattened out. That's something that we've seen fairly often on e-bikes that are capable of Class 3 speeds or higher, but that ship as Class 2s. They're made to be able to go a little faster, but they just have that limitation placed on them. We did a second test in Class 3 mode, and the power distribution across those PAS settings ended up looking a lot more evenly spread out with a nice linear pattern, and this is exactly what we like to see. We think it would be great if they could figure out how to distribute those power levels when the bike is limited to 20 miles per hour, just so people who can't or don't want to unlock the bike can get the same benefit. But like I said, this is a pretty common thing with similar bikes. As far as power and handling goes though, the Rift had zero problems reaching either 20 or 28 miles per hour depending on what setting it was in. And even though this is a pretty big and heavy bike, It's around 85 pounds. It did handle well overall. It takes turns a little wide, but you kind of expect that on bikes like this. I do want to say that the chain on this bike is a little on the longer side, so I noticed that it made quite a bit of noise at times. There's a chainstay protector included here, but it almost seems like some sort of additional tensioner would help things out too. This bike did really well in our range test, but we kind of expected that it would, considering the fact that it has a 960 watt-hour battery. Based on our 2 range tests, you can expect a range of between 44 and 62 miles, depending on what setting you're in and how much power you're getting from the motor. Ride1UP advertises a range of between 45 and 60 miles, so our results are spot on with theirs, and that's exactly what we like to see. That amount of range is also just a lot of miles and a lot of time that you can spend riding around on the bike. Our range tests took between 2.5 and 4.5 hours, so you can definitely get a lot out of this battery before you'll need to recharge it. If we compare our test results with the Rift to the other fat tire e-bikes we've tested, the Rift did a spectacular job in PAS 5. It didn't quite make the top of the list, but the one bike that beat it has a torque sensor. That one was just naturally going to be a bit more efficient than the Rift, but that bike's rider also had to put in a little bit more effort, so there's definitely a trade-off there. I noticed on this test that the bike's kickstand protrudes out from the chainstay quite a bit, and I ended up scraping the heel of my shoe on it pretty often. I wear a US men's size 12 shoe, which is big but also not uncommon, so I think a lot of other riders are probably going to have the same problem. For me, it wasn't bad enough that it hurt or really interfered with my pedaling, but it was kind of annoying, and I think it's something that Ride1UP should take a look at to see if they can move the kickstand back a bit further. One thing about that, I know that if the rear rack is fully loaded up, the placement of the kickstand is pretty important to make sure the bike can stay balanced. So I understand if that is something to do with it, but I'd still challenge Ride1UP to find another solution. The Rift did great on our hill test too, and we kind of expected that just because of the fact that it's a fat tire bike, and those just generally tend to handle hills without any problem. In PAS 5, we measured a time of 1 minute and 7 seconds and an average speed of 16.2 miles per hour, which is pretty standard or average if we compare that with similar bikes we've tested, but in reality that's pretty fast, especially on our test hill. On throttle power, we measured a little bit of a slower time, which is totally normal, and that was 1 minute and 13 seconds with an average of 14.9 miles per hour. That's actually one of the best times we've seen from the throttle test on a fat tire e-bike. Our big takeaway here is that the Rift has the power to just do about anything, and that was actually backed up by one of my experiences on the bike. I mentioned that I took it off-road a few times, and there's this one spot in particular that we used to try out the really big and powerful bikes. It's a little hill, but it's super steep, and before this test, only the all-terrain bikes we've tested had been able to make it up, but the Rift did awesome, and I pedaled right up with no problem at all. On more average hills though, one of the nice things about bikes like this, and the Rift specifically, is that, again, the motor's kind of doing all the work for you, and that allows you to just take it easy. All right, I have a confession to make. I totally underestimated this bike. It's not that I thought it was gonna do poorly, I just didn't think it was gonna stand out quite as much as it did. It's not perfect, and I think the 2 biggest things that need a little bit of work are the stem and the kickstand. An adjustable stem would just make it easier for taller people to get a good fit, and the kickstand placement issue was just sort of a minor annoyance, but I think moving it back would help out a lot of taller or heavier people with big feet, who I also think are just naturally going to gravitate toward this bike. Overall though, the Rift totally rocks, and it did a fantastic job in our testing. It's got really great range, it's awesome on hills, its brakes are solid, and it has a really powerful and responsive motor. But on top of that, I think the fact that this is sort of a hybrid fat tire and utility bike that can carry an extra rider is just really unique and unexpected. This bike really can do it all. It has speed and power, it can deal with tougher environments way better than I would have guessed, and it gives you the ability to bring a friend along with you on a ride. So I think if those things sound appealing and you want a good cost-friendly but capable bike, I think you're going to be really happy with the Rift. Thanks for sticking with me today. If you'd like to read our written review, which goes into more detail about everything I talked about, please check out the link in the video description. We'll also leave a link to the Ride1UP website where you can take a look at the Rift a little closer. Please do use that link if you decide to purchase the bike. This doesn't cost anything extra, but it does help to support our channel and keeps these reviews coming. Please also like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know what you think about the Rift down in the comments section. That's all for today. Again, I'm John with Electric Bike Report, and this is the Ride1UP Rift.